Someone was asking me at the break how to find episodes of the show that we do, Creation Magazine Live. If you don't get the Miracle Channel, or if you're not on Roku or some of the other broadcasters that we broadcast on, you can go to the website, or you can find our channel on YouTube, and you'll find all of those episodes there. All right, so here we are in November, and so people start thinking about Christmas. And I had some thoughts of this myself. I started thinking about an idea for a Christmas card. I started with this image right here, and then I added this. Because nothing says Christmas like dinosaurs, right? Okay, how about something a little more traditional? Take the nativity scene. Mary and Joseph, the baby, and some of the animals there, right? Now, I realize this looks a little weird, right? Because, see, it's not to scale. I had to shrink some of those guys down. No, the reason this image looks weird to us is we're not used to picturing dinosaurs when we read something out of the Bible. As a matter of fact, we're really not used to the idea of picturing dinosaurs alongside people in general. And that's probably because of images like this that we've seen. You ever see something like that in a textbook or something, right? It's this idea that at some point in time there was the age of the dinosaurs, a period in time when dinosaurs were dominant on the earth. There were no people or birds. Or if there were mammals, they were just, small little things starting out. Usually there's volcanoes showing and different vegetation, right? I think we've seen that kind of imagery. Well, that idea comes from the geologic column. Probably seen that represented before. The idea that there's all these many, many layers of rock that are full of fossils. And what tends to happen is evolutionists read that fossil record like it's a history book of the earth. The notion that the layers took millions of years to form slowly and gradually, therefore the fossils in those layers must represent creatures that were alive millions of years ago. And you look through that general fossil record, and you can see generally from bottom to top, it appears that we go from relatively simple creatures to more complex. And you go up in the layers, and eventually you get into some different things like reptiles. And there's some layers here where we find all the dinosaur fossils. And so those layers are interpreted as a period in time from about 230 million years ago to about 65 million years ago, and that's referred to as the age of the dinosaurs. So that's where we get ideas like this. In textbooks, storybooks, movies like The Land Before Time. Anybody ever watch those? Littlefoot and the Gang, right? Right? This whole idea permeates so much in the media. But it's all hinged on the idea that the layers of rock took millions of years to form slowly and gradually, and that evolution then happened during those millions of years. Well, we've already talked today about how layers of rock can form very, very quickly, even the very fine layers. I won't go into this in depth again, but Mount St. Helens showed us how these many layers of rock right there got laid down very quickly in a matter of just days. Right? Showing that those layers didn't necessarily form gradually. And we talked also about fossilization already. How fossilization doesn't happen slowly and gradually. Things have to be buried rapidly. It doesn't necessarily take millions of years for a fossil to form. For example, here's a hat that was found in New Zealand at the base of a volcano. The volcano erupted and it buried the village. About 60 years later, they dug everything out and they found things like this hat completely fossilized, turned to stone. So obviously it doesn't take millions of years for fossils to happen. Another example, back in Charles Darwin's day, he didn't believe that soft-bodied creatures like jellyfish, for example, could be fossilized because he thought it was a slow process. They'd basically disintegrate before they could be fossilized. But we find many examples of things like this. Many, many jellyfish actually beautifully preserved in the fossil record. Doesn't work if it was slow and gradual, but if they were buried rapidly, it makes perfect sense. And you may notice here that the fossil on the one side there, it's kind of pretty much identical to jellyfish that we see today. And yet, the fossil is supposed to be 500 million years old. What happened there? See, that's what's known as a living fossil. And it's a fossil that looks identical to something that's still around and it hasn't changed. So no evolution there. And there's many examples of that through the fossil record. But what about this idea about dinosaurs and those many millions of years, and how that maybe affects our thinking as we read these children's books and watch Littlefoot and so on? Here's an interesting mention from Tom Holland, a historian. He said, "First there were dinosaurs. I vividly remember my shock when I opened a children's Bible and found an illustration on its first page of Adam and Eve with a brachiosaur. 6 years old I may have been, but of one thing I was rock solid certain. No human being had ever seen a sauropod. A faint shadow of doubt for the first time had been brought to darken my Christian faith." 6 years old. And he's already convinced that humans have never seen a dinosaur. Why? Because they went extinct 65 millions of years ago, and humans didn't come along till much later. And so he sees that depicted in the Bible and says, Bible can't be true. He's already having some doubts, even at that age. Here's another one from a blog. He says, "Dinosaurs were my gateway drug to atheism. And while I was still 6 or 7 years away from reaching the conclusion that God either didn't care about us or didn't exist, the dinosaurs had shared an important secret, that the Bible can be wrong." Gateway drug to atheism. If the Bible can be wrong about dinosaurs, it can be wrong about everything else too, including Jesus. This is the kind of logic that we find happening. So then we come to the question about dinosaurs and the Bible, and where do they fit in history? We've already talked about Creation Week and those 6 literal days in which God created. And we won't go through this in as much detail this time, but, you know, dinosaurs very clearly existed at some point in time. We have loads of fossil evidence. And God obviously must have created dinosaurs then. So where do they fit? Especially if they're millions of years old. Well, one option is we could try to put them in before Creation Week. Right? Somehow before Creation Week started, before Adam. But then we run into that problem we already talked about. If those dinosaurs were millions of years before that, and their fossils are millions of years before Adam, then that means you got millions of years of death before sin. And now the gospel doesn't make sense. So that's a real problem there. Well, what if we put them in after Creation Week? I mean, fossils are remnants of things that have died. And since the wages of sin is death, death came into the world as a result of sin. Therefore, the fossils would make sense if they fit in after Adam's sin, so after Creation Week. But then, what do we do with the millions of years? We've already seen in biblical history that there's nowhere near enough room for millions of years of history after Adam. They just don't possibly fit there. But we have those fossils. So I'm gonna ask for a little audience participation in this session, okay? So kids and grown-ups, feel free to yell out an answer every now and then when I invite you to. In Creation Week, if God created dinosaurs, on what day do you think the dinosaurs were created? 6. Very good. Very good. See, the word dinosaur actually refers to a land animal. We'll get more into that in a minute, right? There's other creatures that are associated with the dinosaurs, like plesiosaurs and pterosaurs. Now, they obviously would have been created on day 5. But the word dinosaur refers to land animals, so that means they were created day 6, as we can see when we read that account from Genesis 1. So, what I'm suggesting is that God created dinosaurs on day 6 of Creation Week, and as we've seen, that was approximately 6,000 years ago. That's a mind-blowing idea considering what we've all been taught about dinosaurs up to now, isn't it? So I wonder if there's ever any evidence to suggest that dinosaurs are not millions of years old. Well, back in 1993, a lady named Mary Schweitzer found a TRex bone that was not fully fossilized. They actually had to break it open, and inside they found red blood cells inside the bone. This was not fossilized, these are red blood cells. Now, nobody would expect to see such a thing in something they thought was millions of years old, because red blood cells don't last that long. Biologically speaking, that's not possible. In fact, she ran the experiment 17 times to make sure that what she was seeing was real. Because, hey, there were a lot of skeptics out there within the evolutionary community, as you can imagine. She said herself, if you take a blood sample and you stick it on a shelf, you have nothing recognizable in about a week. So why would there be anything left in dinosaurs? And yet there they were. I just got goosebumps because everyone knows these things don't last 65 million years. There's the mindset. Now, other colleagues, of course, tried to dispute that what she was finding was even real. She said, I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none. Power of a paradigm. So here's some actual physical evidence that shows there's red blood cells in something that shouldn't be there after millions of years. This reviewer doesn't believe the data because he's convinced that the bones have to be millions of years old. How scientific is that, really? Now, since then, there have been many, many other discoveries like this, many of them made by Schweitzer herself. This one comes from 2005. She opened a TRex bone and found actual blood vessels that were still soft and stretchy. Now, this isn't a bone she thought was 68 million years old, and yet you got this soft and stretchy material. Again, it shouldn't be there. We found things like bits of proteins, collagen, even bits of DNA have been found in dinosaur bones, one of them fairly recently. Now, DNA is highly unstable. It's been calculated that the most amount of time that DNA could potentially survive, and still have a couple of nucleotides left, would be about 6.8 million years. If it was kept at -5 degrees Celsius constantly. None of these have been kept at -5 degrees for millions of years. And that's still a tenth of what we've been led to believe these dinosaur bones are. Right? These are highly unstable things. Other things we find, I mentioned in the last session that carbon-14 has been found in dinosaur bones. Now, you've probably heard of carbon-14 dating. It's a way of trying to estimate the age of a living thing, a fossil. It's not used on, it's used on fossils. But see, carbon-14 has a short half-life of about 5,730 years, meaning that after 5,730 years, you should have half as much carbon-14 as you had as when that creature first died. And then we do the math on that, and really, carbon-14 should not exist in anything for more than 50 to 100,000 years. Our instruments can't detect it past that. In fact, one of our scientists calculated that if the entire Earth was made up of carbon-14 atoms, they would all decay in 1 million years. So there shouldn't be any in something that's supposed to be many millions of years old. It doesn't make sense. Here's an example from a scientific conference a few years back where some scientists presented their finding of carbon-14 in some dinosaur bones, projecting those fossils then to be under 50,000 years old. And the organizers actually took their data down from the website after that and wrote this letter. They said, the interpretation which you present in your abstract is that the age of various dinosaurs, previously interpreted as being Mesozoic in age, are less than 50,000 years. You report that these ages were calculated using C14 methods. There is obviously an error in this data. The abstract was apparently not reviewed properly and was accepted in error. For this reason, we have exercised our authority as program chairs and rescinded the abstract. The abstract will no longer appear on our website. So never mind what the data said. that can't possibly be true, because we know those bones have to be millions of years old. The power of a paradigm. Now, we talked about soft tissue and dinosaur bones. Here's an interesting specimen. You can go to the Royal Tyrrell Museum and look at this guy. I was there myself about a year ago. This is a nodosaur that was dug up in Fort McMurray while they're digging in the oil sands. Now, what's interesting about this guy is this isn't just bone. There's actual soft tissue. There's actual flesh and skin. This is a 3D fossil. Amazing preservation of this thing, which is related to the ankylosaur, which you may have seen. It's got that ball on the end of its tail. Now, they estimate from the remains that this was about 18 feet long when it was alive, weighed around 3,000 pounds. They said it was buried rapidly upside down. I wonder how that happened. They noted the 3D preservation, the soft tissue, and even a reddish pigment in the skin. That's extremely rare in any fossil find, even to find fossilized skin to start with. Now, take a look at this, the image on the bottom right. See where those speckles are? Researchers speculate that that is the remains of the remnants of this creature's last meal. And yet, they'd like us to believe that this thing is 110 million years old. And they find all of these things. Here's some of the reactions of the researchers at the time. One of them said, we don't just have a skeleton, we have a dinosaur as it would have been. Dr. Jacob Vintner, who's an expert on fossilized skin, he said, this might have been walking around a couple of weeks ago. Well, maybe not a couple of weeks ago, but probably not many millions of years either. Now, we find this kind of soft tissue all over the place in the fossil record, in other things besides dinosaurs, including some in sea worms that were found that are supposed to be 500 million years old. And yet there's still soft tissue there. How does that happen? So there is scientific evidence to indicate that dinosaurs were in fact much, much younger than the millions of years we've been taught. Excuse me. And may very well, in fact, fit within biblical history. So the question is, why aren't there dinosaurs in the Bible? You ever find the word dinosaur in the Bible anywhere? I don't understand. Why didn't God write about them? Well, the word dinosaur actually comes from the term meaning terrible lizard. The word was invented by Sir Richard Owen in 1841. It was used to describe these creatures that were being found. You know, different types of dinosaurs were being dug up, and this was a word he used to describe this category of creature. Now, English translations of the Bible go back quite a bit before that. Right? The King James, for example, 1611. So this means that when the Bible was first translated into English, the word dinosaur didn't exist. They couldn't have used it if they wanted to. And they don't want to use it now because of the millions of years. It'd be pretty controversial. But I wonder if there are other words in the Bible that might refer to dinosaurs. Let's take a look at Job 20. Now here, God is referring Job to many of the things in his creation. And he says, behold behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. Further down, he says he is the first of the works of God. Now, God is describing an actual creature that he created, just like he created Job. And he says, behold behemoth. Which says to me that Job must have been able to understand who he was talking about. He must have been able to see this thing at some point in time. Otherwise, why would you say that? I mean, if I said to you, behold the CN Tower. If you've never been there or seen a picture of it, that wouldn't mean a whole lot to you. So God's referring to an actual creature that Job would understand and recognize. But take a look at the description. A tail stiff like a cedar. And here we've probably got the cedars of Lebanon in view, right? Not some spindly little thing. Well, if you have footnotes in your Bible, somewhere it might suggest that behemoth was an elephant or a hippopotamus. Now please understand, the footnotes in your Bible as helpful as they can be, they're not the inspired Word of God. Right? Well-meaning theologians trying to help us along, but they can make some mistakes. Take a look at an elephant's tail. That look like a cedar tree to you? How about a hippopotamus? Worse, man. No cedar trees here, right? So these really don't match the description. Why then, I wonder, would these people writing the footnotes suggest that behemoth might be an elephant or a hippopotamus? It's because they probably can't fathom the notion that Job might have seen something like this. There's a sauropod dinosaur with a massive tail. Now, researchers have told us in recent years that some of these sauropods could actually make their tail swing like a club. Tail stiff like a cedar. Now, that qualifies as first of the works of God. And obviously something God created. So what if Job actually saw something like that? The commentators don't understand that idea because they're stuck in that millions of years paradigm. In Job 41, we read about another creature called Leviathan. And part of the description here is his back is made of rows of shields shut up closely as with a seal. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. What does this sound like to you? That sounds like a dragon, don't it? Now, again, we're talking about a creature that God created that Job would recognize. This is a real creature, not making anything up here. So, I wonder if there's anything in the fossil record that might qualify for the description of Leviathan here. There's been a number of candidates put forward. One of them nowadays is Sarcosuchus imperator, a long name for really big crocodile. Okay? This thing looked very much like a crocodile, but could grow up to 40 feet long. The head itself could measure up to 6 feet long. Now, one picture there gives you a kind of a scale comparison of the head of a crocodile compared to the skull of a Sarcosuchus. And now, one of the interesting things about this is that this creature had a bulbous cavity at the end of its snout, right, kind of an empty chamber. Now, nobody really knows for sure what that was for, because there's a lot of things we have to speculate from fossils because we don't have all that soft tissue. Well, one possibility is perhaps this creature was able to use that to put together some kind of chemicals and perhaps create sparks and smoke and so forth. For example, the bombardier beetle carries 2 different chemicals in its hind end, and then is able to mix them together and shoot that out in a hot burning liquid with a popping sound to fend off predators. Right? But has to keep those chemicals separate. Electric eels carry a lot of voltage in their flesh. So it's possible that Sarcosuchus could have possibly used that chamber for some kind of chemical reaction to create sparks and the appearance of fire. From that, you would get the notion of a fire-breathing dragon, wouldn't you? Incidentally, dragon is another word we find in the Bible, often referred to as a real creature, not just some mythological or symbolic usage. For example, here in Deuteronomy, it says their wine is the poison of dragons and the cruel venom of asps. In that context, dragons apparently is a real creature, just like those asps are. Or Psalm 91. Thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under feet. Again, in context, referring to this creature called a dragon as a real creature. Now, you'll notice that these are from the King James Version, which is a little older than our more modern versions, which probably translate this a little bit differently. But obviously, a few hundred years ago, English translators had no problem using the word dragon in the text to refer to an actual creature that lived. And dragon is a word that we come across all through history and various cultures. In fact, before Richard Owen came up with the word dinosaur, some of those first dinosaur remains that they found, the plesiosaurs and so on, they were actually referring to them as dragons. They had no problem, even in the early 1800s, thinking of a dragon as an actual creature. Maybe you're familiar with the Chinese Zodiac, those 12 different creatures, right? You know that cycle of years, right? You got the year of the rat and the year of the horse and so forth, right? And of course, we're all aware there's the year of the dragon. So isn't it interesting that, you've got 11 different creatures that we all know and recognize, right? We can still see them today. And then there's this thing called a dragon, which many would suggest is a mythological creature. But does it really make sense to come up with 11 actual creatures and then some totally mythological made-up one? Or is that dragon actually based on a real creature that lived at some point in time? Now, I'm not an expert on the Chinese language, but I found out this little bit. Anybody here tell me what those two symbols there mean? Translate that into English for me. Dinosaur? You're right. You're right. You can probably actually read that, right? Is that cool? All right. Well, now here's the interesting thing, though. I'm going to give you another one. What does that symbol by itself mean? Isn't it weird that the symbol used for dragon is incorporated into the term for dinosaur? As if maybe they're kind of the same, or at least similar. See, it's been noted over the years that what we call dinosaurs bear a striking resemblance to what we hear about as dragons in various legends and artworks. In fact, one of the late church fathers, John of Damascus, did a lot of research into this concept of dragons in the Bible as not just symbolic, but actual creatures. And he writes here, Dio the Roman, who wrote the history of the Roman Empire and Republic, reports the following. One day, when Regulus, a Roman consul, was fighting against Carthage, a dragon suddenly crept up and settled behind the wall of the Roman army. The Romans killed it by order of Regulus, skinned it, and sent its hide to the Roman Senate. When the dragon's hide, as Dio says, was measured by order of the Senate, it happened to be, amazingly, 120 feet long, and the thickness was fitting to the length. So here's one of the church fathers, right, a respected theologian, explaining that here's a Roman historian talking about an actual encounter that the Roman army had with something they called a dragon, 120 feet long. We find a dragon on the flag of Wales, and that dates back probably to at least 1400 AD. We find legends like St. George and the dragon that you may have heard about, and is depicted in this artwork. Right? St. George considered a hero for saving everybody from this fearsome creature. Or from Scandinavia, we read about Beowulf and the dragon. Right? All of these stories from different cultures around the world that incorporate these fearsome creatures known as dragons. Well, what if Beowulf actually came across something that looked more like this? That would certainly inspire some legends, wouldn't it, if you managed to kill something like that? Anybody seen any of the Jurassic Park movies, right? You consider that's a pretty heroic thing. As I said, it's been acknowledged, even by paleontologists, the similarity between what we call dinosaurs and these dragons of legend. Here's an entry from an encyclopedia. It said, the dragons of legend are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They are much like the great reptiles or dinosaurs which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on earth. Well, what if they didn't appear long before man? What if they'd actually coexisted with man for a time? That would certainly inspire some of these stories. A few years ago, a skeleton of a dinosaur was dug up. It looked so much like a dragon, or what we think of as a dragon, they called this thing TRex Hogwartsia. Look at that thing. Look at the shape of the head. Look at that thing. On the banner, it says it's a new type of dinosaur that looks like a dragon. Maybe they were one and the same thing. Now, at the time, National Geographic published a picture on their front cover of what they thought the head of Dracorex might look like if it had skin on it, right? And it looked like this. Now, that's something out of The Hobbit or something, isn't it? Come on. Now, as I say, this has been acknowledged over and over again by paleontologists. They don't have a real good explanation for it, you understand, but it's been acknowledged. And there's other things around the world too, in various artworks and so forth, where the descriptions are very much like a dinosaur, not even dragon-like in our understanding. For example, go to Angkor, Cambodia, and we find a temple there. There's a pillar on this temple where there's a number of sculptures going up, and we see a number of recognizable creatures in these sculptures, a monkey, a water buffalo, and so forth. And then there's one here. I want you to tell me, go ahead and yell out, what do you think this looks like? Go ahead. I heard rhino. Stegosaurus. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the plates on the back and the tail and the way it's shaped. Now, the head's a little different from what we often see depicted, but then again, there could easily have been different varieties of stegosaur. You see, children all over the world have looked at that picture and said, that looks like a stegosaurus. Right? Now, here's my question. How do those children know what a stegosaurus looks like?
Seen one.
You seen one? An actual stegosaurus? How do you know what a stegosaurus looks like? Seen it in a book, maybe? Right? Seen it in a museum somewhere. There's a depiction of a stegosaurus. Maybe you saw it in the land before time. Right? We've got all of that, right? Fossils have been dug up and they're put in museums and we have those images. Okay. How did this artist 800 years ago know what a stegosaurus looked like? Because there were no fossils dug up at that point. There were no museums, no land before time. More likely, he saw something like that or had it described to him by someone else who saw it. And this isn't an isolated case. You go to Carlisle Cathedral in the UK, you can find the tomb of the Bishop of Carlisle, who was buried there in 1496. He's buried in the floor of the cathedral. You can actually go there and ask to see it. Around the outside of the tomb on the top, there's brass engravings all the way around. And again, there's different creatures that have been engraved in the brass. I'm going to show you a few of these, and I want you to go ahead and yell out what this is. What's this look like to you? Bird, yeah. That's a dog. How about this one? The fish. How about that one? Dinosaur? Hey, wait, I said 1496. How could that possibly be dinosaur? But it looks like that, right? It does. It looks like two sauropod dinosaurs with their necks intertwined. In 1496 BC, or AD, I should say, long before the museums and the fossils and so forth. Now, another interesting thing is that there was a Mesopotamian cylinder seal that was found. Thousands of years ago, these were used to make impressions on clay, and this one was found. And this is what the clay looks like when you actually roll this out. Looks kind of the same, doesn't it? Same image, two sauropods, necks intertwined. So again, how did these two artists, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, come up with basically the same image if they made it up? Or maybe one of them actually saw this, or perhaps they both did. Fran Barnes is a recognized authority on rock art or petroglyphs in the American West. And he wrote in one of his books, he said, there is a petroglyph in Natural Bridges National Monument that bears a startling resemblance to a dinosaur with a long tail and neck, small head and all. Now this is what he's talking about. Now, it's kind of faded now, right? But you can kind of see it on the rock there. This is what it looks like if we put an outline around this thing. Okay, somebody added a mouth and an eyeball as artistic flair, but the general shape, right? Looks like a sauropod dinosaur again. And this from several hundred years ago. Go to Australia, we find a painting of what looks like a plesiosaur being surrounded by people. Again, long before any of this was in the museums, but you got people and a plesiosaur together. So there's all of this evidence around the world, in the fossils, in artifacts, in legends that we hear. It would appear that people have seen dinosaurs in the Bible, in those Bible times, and even since then. So that would mean that somehow dinosaurs had to have been on Noah's Ark. Somehow they survived the flood. Looks kind of silly there, doesn't it? I mean, how do you get those two big guys on that little ark, right? How do you do that? Okay, cute as this picture might be, it's not biblically accurate. Sorry if you've used pictures like this in Sunday school, but when we look at the dimensions of the ark described, we get something that looks much more like this. A huge structure, at least 450 feet long, 45 feet tall, 75 feet wide. We're talking 1.5 football fields long, this thing. 3 decks, lots of room in there for all the animals, 2 of each created kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing animals, and all the birds, and certainly Noah and his family, and still likely be lots of room for the food and water. I'll show you that in a minute. Now, the volume has been calculated. You're probably sort of aware of the size of a standard railway boxcar, right? You see those? Where I live, there's hardly any trains going by anymore, but I remember them when I was a kid. Now, Noah's Ark has been estimated to have held the equivalent volume of 522 of those railway boxcars. That's a lot of room. Now, even so, how do you get those big dinosaurs on there? I mean, come on, they're pretty tall, right? Well, one thing we know is that all dinosaurs started out the same way. Every one of them started out as an egg. Now, the largest fossilized dinosaur egg that's ever been found is just about 24 inches long. That's quite large. Most of them tend to be no bigger than the size of a football. I'm not suggesting that Noah took a bunch of dinosaur eggs on the ark. Who would hatch them? However, when you consider they started off that small, there had to be some in-between stages, right? In fact, by examining the leg bones of an Apatosaurus, it's been estimated that dinosaurs actually went through a growth spurt. They started out fairly small the first few years, but then after a few years, they basically hit puberty, right? And they'd shoot up, just like your teenager, grow really fast, really quick, eat everything in the house. And then they get to full size and they level off. This is the growth rate of an Apatosaurus that's been graphed. Now, where that upslope is, estimated a maximum growth rate of about 5,500 kilograms per year. That's about the size of an elephant every year. And you want to tell me Behemoth was an elephant? Now, we start to think about whether or not dinosaurs could be on the ark. If you're Almighty God, and you know the flood's going to last about a year, are you going to put 2 of the big granddaddy dinosaurs that are going to take up all the room and eat everything? Or are you going to send a couple of juveniles that are still only a few feet tall before they hit their growth spurt? And maybe you could even time it so that when they get off the ark, they're ready to hit that growth spurt and go out and replenish the earth. I think Almighty God's smart enough to do that. And so when we look at a picture like that, really those dinosaurs should be much smaller getting on the ark. In fact, if we look at this image here, probably no bigger than that. Now, again, some of this is speculation, obviously, because we weren't there, but it's all scientifically plausible. Now, the question is, well, yeah, but how many animals can you get on the ark? Noah didn't actually have to take 2 of every species of creature that we know today. He didn't need to take 600 and some odd species of dog, for example. He needed 2 of the created kind from which dogs come, as well as wolves and dingoes and many other species. 2 of the created kind, and then natural selection created different species after that as differentiation happened. Same with all the other creatures. Same with the dinosaurs. Probably, out of hundreds of different dinosaur species, probably more than 50 or 55 actual kinds of dinosaur. And they weren't all really big. Right? We think of the really big ones, but there are actually quite a few small dinosaurs, some of them as small as a chicken. The average size of all dinosaurs that we know of was probably the size of about a buffalo. average it out. So we come back to this geologic column and this idea of the age of the dinosaurs that we're told about, because those are the layers of rock where we find those fossils. Now the idea is we figure, this is the age of the dinosaurs, and then after that mammals evolved and became more dominant. We get more in the way of birds, modern birds and so forth, and eventually we get into some human remains that are farther up. So, that's the notion that the fossil record gives us that progression. But the fossil record isn't actually that neat and clean. It's not that. There's actually a lot of overlap in the things we find. Again, a little more audience participation here. I'm going to show you some pictures, and I want you to tell me what the picture is. What is this? It's a cow. Yeah, what's that? It's a horse. What about that? Dog. What about this? Nope. Sorry, that's not a duck. No, see, this is this is actually meant to be a representation that some artist came up with for a creature called Gansus. And Gansus is a fossil that was found, thought to be about 120 million years old, right smack dab in the middle of the dinosaur era, right? Now, okay, it looks like a duck. And you know how it goes if it looks like a duck and so forth, right? But the evolutionists would have to say, no, I'm sorry, this is not a duck. Why? Because there weren't supposed to be any modern birds like ducks around in the age of the dinosaur. It messes up the timeline. They started to acknowledge possibility of a few mammals and birds there, but the idea of this being a duck, no, they're not ready to go there yet. So it must be something a little bit different. Yet we find creatures supposedly out of place. We find things like flying squirrels and beavers and different kinds of mammals, hundreds of different kinds of mammals found in the layers where we find the dinosaur fossils. My favorite's the one on the far end there. That's a fossil of a small dinosaur that was found in the belly of a mammal. So not only were mammals around with the dinosaurs and not later, but they were eating them. Hey, what'd you have for lunch today? You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Remember, some of them were small as a chicken. And actually, paleontologists have known this for quite a while. Here's a museum curator. He said, we find mammals in almost all our dinosaur dig sites. These were not noticed years ago. We have about 20,000 pounds of bentonite clay that has mammal fossils that we are trying to give away to some researcher. It's not that they're not important, it's just that you only live once, and I specialize in something other than mammals. I specialize in reptiles and dinosaurs. So he's admitting they've known about these mammals in with the dinosaurs all along. He says, I ignored them because I wanted to look at the dinosaurs. Can you think of any other reason why an evolutionist might ignore the mammals in those layers? Same reason Gansus can't be a duck. Same reason those red blood cells in a TRex bone can't be red blood cells. Messes up the evolutionary timeline. We keep coming across this evidence that defies that story that we've been told over and over and over again. The fossil record is not clean cut. The first 95% of the entire fossil record is actually creatures that live at the bottom of the ocean. Jellyfish and so forth, right? And then of the remaining 5%, it's mostly plant matter. So there's only 1/4 of 1% of the fossil record that's made up of vertebrates, whether it be a fish or an amphibian or a mammal or a dinosaur, right? And it's kind of jumbled up, which kind of defies the notion that one thing evolves slowly into another thing. It's getting harder and harder and harder to claim that according to where we find these fossils, and that's if it's a record of time. On the other hand, if the fossil record is evidence for a global flood, then it makes perfect sense that you might have kind of a general burial order, because things at the bottom of the ocean are going to get buried first, right? And then fish, and then land animals and so on. But it would make sense that they might be jumbled up a little bit. So we've seen all this evidence in that dinosaurs have lived relatively recently, even maybe just a few hundred years ago. They were in Bible times. They've been on the ark. So the question is, well, what happened to the dinosaurs? You don't look around now and see dinosaurs hanging out on the corner, right? So, I mean, generally speaking, it would appear that dinosaurs are extinct. Well, there's a number of theories out there for the extinction of dinosaurs, and one is this from Gary Larson. You put that on the cigarette pack. Don't smoke, you'll go extinct. Or here's another one. How about this? Maybe they missed the boat, man. I used to subscribe to that until I found out about the growth spurt and realized they could easily be on the ark. Okay, those are kind of fun, but evolutionists do have a number of different ideas. Right? They can't really agree on anything, but the most popular idea is the asteroid impact theory. The notion that something like 66 million years ago, a meteorite hit the Earth and created such a dust cloud and so forth that it blocked out the sun, and that affected dinosaurs and caused dinosaurs to go extinct, but not the mammals and the birds. Yeah, there's some holes in that theory even amongst evolutionists. One of my favorites is, I like to call it the competition theory. Yeah, we humans, we don't play well with other predators, do we? I mean, you might think, well, it'd be pretty hard to hunt down a dinosaur. You know what? We caused whales to be nearly extinct by hunting them down with boats and a stick on the end of a rope. We're pretty ingenious when it comes to hunting things down. I suspect that St. George and the Dragon was an account of somebody hunting down a dinosaur. Now, what do you think would happen if in your neighborhood a bear or a mountain lion or something came prowling around your neighborhood? What would happen? There's probably going to be a few guys out there with rifles, right? You're going to get a hunting license. You're going to be hunting that thing down. Somebody may be going to put it up on the wall and be considered some kind of a hero, perhaps, for protecting your families. Probably that's what happened with St. George. He was considered a hero for getting rid of a predator. Now, there's probably a number of different factors that contribute to the extinction of dinosaurs, as with any other species. So there's other theories out there include genetic drift, things that happen in the genetics after the flood that cause some to be less able to survive than others. Of course, there's definite climate change after a global flood. Right? Probably an ice age within a few hundred years. That could have had an effect on them as well. Other habitat changes, probably changes to their food source, because a whole lot of vegetation went away and there wouldn't have been as much of it right after the flood. It would take a while for it to come back. And of course, disease is a factor for any species. There's all of these different things that could easily contribute to the ultimate extinction of dinosaurs over time. But it doesn't mean that they all went extinct at once 65 million years ago. That's just the particular interpretation of the layers of rock based on a particular worldview. So, dinosaurs were created on day 6, and they've lived throughout biblical history up until possibly just a few hundred years back. Let's consider that story about Adam and Eve again. Remember Tom Holland? Looked in that Bible, saw a picture something like this. Dinosaurs could have been in the Garden of Eden. But hey, don't have to worry about it, because at that point, nobody was eating meat. Remember, God called all of the creatures to eat plants, no carnivory. That came later, after sin came into the world. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says this: "We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." The notion of dinosaurs living millions of years ago before human beings is it's an opinion that's raised against the knowledge of God. Right? It runs in direct contrast to what the Bible says, and we've seen that it's caused people to drift away from believing the Bible. And so we need to take that idea of dinosaurs, because dinosaurs were a real thing. We have to take that and understand that within the context of biblical history. And they do fit into biblical history incredibly well. And remember, 1 Peter tells us to be prepared to give an answer. People are going to ask you about dinosaurs if they haven't already. They're going to want to know, how do they fit in? Don't they contradict the Bible? No, they do not. And I've mentioned a number of resources already. And one you could take a look at is a DVD called Dinosaurs in the Bible. Goes into some of those evidences, again, of dinosaurs in the Bible and other things that we've seen around the world. Similar talk to this one from David Catchpool. Or another one called Dragons or Dinosaurs, which gets a little more in-depth in the notion of what we know of as dragons in legend, or most likely actually dinosaurs from history. Great coffee table book version of this from Vance Nelson. He lives here in Alberta, called Dire Dragons. Shows a number of those artifacts that I've just mentioned. It's a great conversation piece. And then for the kids, we got Exploring Dinosaurs with Mr. Hibb. Little scientific grasshopper called Mr. Hibb. Likes to go out and explore things. And this is all about dinosaurs for ages 9, 10, 11. And I mentioned the Answers book earlier, of course. The whole chapter there on dinosaurs and all the questions that come up. And we're going to take another break here, as was mentioned, so you can go use the washroom, get a drink of water, have a look at what's available.